Decontamination is one of the most critical activities in a hazardous material response. Failure to remove contaminants not only endangers entry team members, it also leads to contamination of other personnel and the environment. The incident management system has primary responsibility for ensuring a safe operation and adequate decontamination of entry team members. However, you must cooperate in this effort by monitoring yourself while working in the hot zone and by providing relevant information to decon and EMS personnel. Because these procedures are so critical to a safe operation, fire department personnel should never commit to a response unless full and thorough decontamination of clothing, equipment, and personnel can be assured. Every hazmat incident involves different variables. The type of chemical involved, the quantity, and the surrounding conditions are only some of the factors that will affect how the response is conducted. In order to accommodate these variables, a decontamination plan must be established in advance. A successful decon plan must be capable of adapting to a variety of situations while providing the most complete and appropriate methods of decontamination. A thorough plan specifies the layout of decontamination stations, the necessary equipment, specific actions, procedures for preventing contaminant transfer, and methods of disposal for contaminated clothing and equipment. Decontamination must be an organized process of incremental steps that reduces or eliminates levels of contamination as it's performed. The process must consist of a series of procedures performed in a specific sequence upwind of the hazard. The sequence must allow for the decontamination and removal of outer garments, gloves and boots, for example, followed by removal of inner clothing. Each station must be separated to prevent cross-contamination. Most decontamination takes place in the warm zone, sometimes referred to as the Contamination Reduction Zone, or CRZ. Entry into and exit from this zone must be tightly controlled. Decon personnel must wear the appropriate level of PPE to protect against any exposures. The appropriate level is determined by both the nature of the incident and the officer in charge. For example, it may be determined that decon personnel must wear vapor protective suits if the entry team's vapor protective clothing and equipment is continuing to emanate vapors after gross decontamination. However, if the level of toxicity and contamination is less severe and vapor hazards are not present, it may be decided that decon personnel are adequately protected by liquid splash protective suits and SCBA. Although your jurisdiction's specific procedures are likely to be different depending on the situation and equipment available, most decon plans incorporate certain basic stations. This diagram, for example, illustrates a decontamination layout for a typical minimum decontamination when low levels of exposure are expected. Although specific procedures undertaken at each station may vary, they are always governed by the incident management system. As part of the management system, the decon officer is responsible for leading all entry team members through the specific steps in the decon process. Your decon procedures may follow the same basic sequence shown in the following example, which illustrates one department's procedures for decontaminating vapor protective clothing. The gross decontamination area is initially set up in the warm zone. However, the boundaries of the hot zone may be extended to include gross decon as the area becomes contaminated. Before gross decontamination, all equipment, such as detection devices and response tools, are placed in the proper container or area for further decontamination later. Gross decon is designed to remove the most hazardous contamination from the surface of protective clothing. Runoff water must be contained for treatment and disposal. In these procedures, outer gloves and boots are removed after gross decontamination. These items are placed in the proper containers and will undergo additional decontamination later. If duct tape is used to secure boots and gloves, it must also be removed and discarded. Gross decon is always followed by a scrub and second rinse in the warm zone. Here, appropriately dressed decon personnel use brushes and a decon solution or detergent to to more thoroughly dissolve and remove contaminants. The scrub is followed by a water rinse. Water should be used in sufficient amounts to rinse thoroughly. However, use only what is needed to reduce problems with containment and disposal of water runoff. A final rinse follows the scrub and rinse. The final rinse removes any remaining decontamination solutions and helps ensure that no contaminants remain on the protective clothing. Protective clothing is removed only after these secondary decontamination procedures have been performed. PPE is usually doffed at the outer perimeter of the warm zone. When removing a vapor protective suit, remember to keep your hands inside and avoid touching the outside of the suit. Inner gloves must be left on for further protection. Decontaminated protective clothing is placed in appropriate containers for later cleaning and drying. SCBA is removed in the cold zone. When removing your tank and facepiece, take care to avoid touching your face with your fingers. SCBA should be laid out in a specified area for inspection and drying. After all other PPE has been doffed, the inner gloves can be removed. Discard these gloves into a separate container for disposal. They must never be reused. After decontamination, entry team personnel must be monitored for vital signs. Team members must be treated promptly if there is any indication of heat stress, fatigue, or water loss. All entry team members must wash thoroughly as a final step in decontamination. Always wash your face and hands immediately. Shower on site or as quickly as possible. At this point in the decon process, your own personal hygiene may be the only determining factor in preventing the spread of contaminants. All equipment used for decontamination, such as buckets, brushes, and tools, must be decontaminated or disposed of properly by other decon personnel. Spent decon solutions and wash water must be collected, tested, and treated. Clothing that's not completely decontaminated must be bagged for further decontamination or disposal. And finally, decon personnel themselves must be decontaminated. In this example situation, decon personnel must scrub, rinse, and follow with a final rinse before removing their splash protective clothing. The decontamination procedures you've just seen are generic and are likely to be different in any given situation. More extensive procedures involving additional stations will be necessary if expected contamination levels are higher or if different PPE ensembles are used. Remember that a good decontamination plan provides contingencies for handling various situations. Despite the thoroughness of your decontamination procedures, you can never be absolutely certain that PPE is completely free of chemicals. PPE can be visually examined for degradation, but many contaminants leave no visible evidence. Decon cleaning solutions can be analyzed, but such tests don't reveal if all of a contaminant has been removed. A thorough evaluation can be done in a laboratory, but these analyses take time and usually result in the destruction of a garment. In other words, there is considerable risk in determining whether a hazmat team member's health and safety will be compromised by using previously contaminated PPE. Always dispose of protective clothing if there is any chance it cannot be adequately decontaminated. As discussed in your textbook, the selection of appropriate PPE is a complex process that's usually best decided by answering a series of questions about the emergency. One of those questions should address whether PPE can be adequately decontaminated. If the answer is other than an unconditional yes, the hazmat team should not take action that will jeopardize fire department members. Selection of appropriate PPE by the officer in charge is one of the first steps in a successful hazmat response. Thorough decontamination is one of the last. Your health and safety, as well as your team members, depends on how carefully you follow your department's SOPs. Remember that decon procedures aren't designed to protect equipment. They're meant to protect the health and safety of the firefighter in the equipment.